What is the difference between probation and parole? Because here in Virginia, even though we abolished parole in 1995, we still have people under the parole system, but we also have people under the probation system. Parole was a system by which people would be sentenced to a certain amount of time, but they would be eligible for a much early release if the parole board determined they should be. So, for example, someone who was sentenced to 40 years in prison would be eligible for parole after 10 years, which was a quarter of their sentence. It wasn't a guarantee that they would get out. In fact, most people got turned down the first few times, and there were both 1 year and 3 year hits. 3 year hits means we're not even going to look at your case again for the next 3 years. 1 year hit means we're at least going to look next year. Now, under Virginia parole, there was also a mandatory release date, which was 50% of your sentence or less if you lost good time. So if you stayed out of trouble, went to school, worked, did all the things you were supposed to, they couldn't hold you for more than 50% of your sentence. But for people who got in trouble and caught charges, I knew guys who did their sentence day for day, even though they would have been eligible for release after a quarter of the time if they just stayed out of trouble. Therefore, parole obviously created an incentive to stay out of trouble. After the 1995 Truth in Sentencing Act, Virginia and a lot of states, as well as the BOP, went to 85%. That meant that at the very best case, if somebody did all their classes and worked and stayed out of trouble, they would do 85% of their time. So with that 40-year sentence, rather than being eligible for parole after 10 years, the best release date would be 34 years. And a lot of guys looked at this as having nothing to lose. Like, why am I worried about staying out of trouble? Because all you can take from me is a few months or a few years. And once you're released, old law guys would be under parole and new law guys would be under probation. And parole meant that if you violated any of the conditions of your release, your parole would be revoked and you could go back for that whole 40 years. Under probation, you can only go back for that portion of your sentence you hadn't already served. So someone getting out for parole on that 40-year sentence after a quarter of their time had 30 years over their head, where that person getting out under probation only had 6 years over their head. So that again creates a really big incentive for guys under parole to stay out of trouble and guys under the new law to say, hey, what do I got to lose?